Well, good morning, everyone, and it's great to have you join today's webinar, An Introduction to Cyber. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Kristine Salgado, and I am a Managing Principal here in the Cyber team at Marsh. I'm also joined by my manager, Kelly Butler, who is the Pacific Cyber Leader here at Marsh. So today's webinar has been designed specifically for members of the Anglican National Insurance Program. And Marsh would like to thank Neil Bull and the ANIP for providing us with this opportunity to host today's webinar. So before I begin, I wanted to briefly run through the agenda for this morning. Firstly, we'll take a step back and establish what cyber risk means in the context of this webinar, because it can often mean very different things to different people. Following this, I will look at the 2019 cyber risk landscape, touch briefly on the value that risk transfer through insurance can provide, and conclude today's webinar by running through some claims examples. There'll also be time for questions at the end of the webinar. The cyber risk landscape is constantly moving and evolving at such a rapid pace. However, there are some foundational things that really make up the core of what cyber risk actually means. This definition is great because it really encompasses what we're talking about when it comes to cyber risk. So cyber risk is commonly defined as exposure to harm or loss resulting from breaches of or attacks on information systems. However, this definition must be broadened. A better, more encompassing definition is the potential of loss or harm related to technical infrastructure or the use of technology within an organisation. So in other words, cyber risk means any risk of financial loss, disruption or damage to the reputation of an organisation from some sort of failure in its information technology systems. What we know is that the threats brought about by cyber risk are not only increasing in frequency, but they're also becoming more severe, diverse and complex. Unlike more traditional business risks, cyber can't be compartmentalised by industry, company size or similar measures. It's indiscriminate. Any business can fall victim to cyber risk or a cyber attack. So here at Marsh, we've developed this great diagram that really helps to simplify cyber risk into its three main components. The first one being who the actor is. So often they're going to be external threat actors, and they're the ones you'll be familiar with. So the cyber criminals, hacktivists, and state-sponsored attackers. But also the actors can be internal actors, who are usually the employees. The intent, so whether it's a malicious intent, which will always be the external actors, which will always apply to the external actors. And also with the internal actors, their intent can be both malicious or accidental. So a well-meaning employee can still bring about cyber risk. The target will always be systems or data or both. The immediate impacts from cyber risk include systems not being available or malfunctioning, so it means that the business isn't able to run at normal operating levels, or data is stolen, deleted, corrupted, or changed. And the potential business impacts are things like response costs. So the initial cost a company may incur to help them actually determine what the issue is, clean up any forensics and also notify any affected parties. Can include things like loss of revenue because the business isn't able to function at normal operating levels, and also reputational damage. So they're all quite significant business impacts that can come about by cyber risk. So before I look at the 2019 cyber risk landscape, I just wanted to quickly recap what we saw in 2018. So we saw that the economic impact of a cyber attack continued to rise. The global average cost of a single data breach in 2018 was US 3.86 million. And that was up from about US 3.6 million in 2017. So this is the average cost to a single organisation globally following a data breach. Really critically, we saw changing risk perceptions. So rather than cyber risk being treated as just an IT issue, we really saw a lot of ownership by management and boards of cyber risk, so that it actually now ranks as a top 5 corporate risk. And we also saw a lot of changing legislation or increased regulatory attention. So you'd be familiar with the Australian mandatory data breach notification legislation that came in last year, which I'll touch on a little later in today's webinar, and also the general data protection regulations, which were the biggest overhaul of privacy data in the EU in 20 years. So what do we expect this year in 2019? We expect more targeted and ambitious attacks with new and emerging threat groups. One thing that we are coming across is this term called living off the land. So what that means is that attackers are using legitimate systems tools, so usually Windows operating system tools, to actually conduct their attacks. The reason that they do this is because it helps to hide their activity more. So if they're using legitimate system tools to actually conduct their malicious attacks, they're going to be harder to detect. And also allows them to remain anonymous because they're not having to use custom malware to actually bring about these attacks. The next thing that we're expecting is supply chain attacks. So they were up quite significantly last year. And also Internet of Things devices will be highly susceptible and targeted. So Internet of Things devices are things that aren't traditionally connected to the internet or network. So smart fridges, video doorbells, home automation devices like Google Home and Amazon Echo, which you might be using at your home. They are often not password protected or rely on standard passwords. So they're going to create a lot more vulnerabilities for threat actors to come in and attack. The insider threat also shouldn't be overlooked. So unfortunately, employees of an organisation are the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity, and I'll also touch on this later in today's presentation. We're also seeing companies realise that it's actually less about security and more about resiliency. So despite the amount of money that's being spent on global security, it still doesn't reduce the economic impact that a cyber attack will have on an organisation. So cyber resiliency is the ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a cyber attack. So it's really approaching cyber risk in a holistic way, protecting your company and considering factors to both prevent an attack as well as ensuring that the organisation can respond to and recover from one. So in this next slide, we've just included it because cyber attacks are still very much focused on external threat actors, and the following list just provides an example of the 10 most common types of cyber attacks that we're seeing carried out by malicious actors. However, for today's webinar, we really wanted to narrow the focus specifically to the education and not-for-profit sectors to see what cyber risks are being faced by members in these groups. So looking firstly at the education sector. In Australia's school system, the focus when it comes to cyber has really been around dealing with cyberbullying, image-based online abuse and irresponsible online behaviour. However, what we're seeing that is a lot more schools are actually implementing technology-led classrooms. There's a lot more reliance on software applications, web-based platforms, mobile learning technologies to actually facilitate learning for students. What this creates, however, is more entry points for unauthorised access to personal identifiable information. And that's because schools hold a lot of sensitive and personal data for teachers, staff and students. So this particular data from an insurer here in Australia shows that within the education sector, the top actions causing cyber incidents are categories called social, which is represented by the purple bar, and also error, which is represented by the orange bar. So I'll go specifically into these two causes shortly. On the second graph, you'll see that the top actors causing cyber incidents are malicious external actors, However, internal actors, which can be both employees and students, still cause over a third of cyber incidents. So this threat actor should definitely not be overlooked. When we look at the not-for-profit sector, this encompasses sort of other sectors which does embody not-for-profits. It is challenging to narrow down claims for not-for-profits specifically because there's just not a lot of reported incidents. They're definitely happening, but we just don't have a lot of data specifically for that sector. Bodies like churches are often targets given the large amounts of money that may be handled, for example, via donations each week, but also databases of confidential information that relate to church members. Another reason a religious body may be targeted is because based on beliefs. So an external actor may want to focus their efforts on targeting religious organisations because they may not agree with the ideologies being shared. So an example a few years ago was a group of anti-Semitic hackers actually targeted the webpage of a Jewish temple in the US. So anyone who visited the website of this temple was actually directed to a webpage that expressed support for the Islamic State. Compounding the cyber risk is the fact that churches and religious organisations have a very welcoming open door policy. So it's really difficult to actually identify any malicious threat actors. Similar to the education sector, the data on the first slide shows that the cyber incidents that we see in the not-for-profit sector is also social. So it's 44% represented by the purple chart. Interestingly, though, is the second chart, which shows that the top actors are tied. So they're both external actors as well as internal actors. So when we talk about the category of social, what do we actually mean by this? Interpol defines social engineering, or what we're talking about, social engineering attacks, which you would be familiar with, and I'm sure you see a lot of these examples in the news. So Interpol defines social engineering fraud as scams used by criminals to trick, deceive, and manipulate their victims into giving out confidential information and funds. What the criminals do is they exploit a person's trust in order to find out their banking details, passwords, or other personal data. And what we're seeing is that hackers are actually taking the time to craft social engineering scenarios with the ultimate goal to build trust and leverage that trust to obtain confidential or sensitive information. So what I thought that I would do is just run through some of the most common social engineering attacks that we're seeing that no organisation is immune to, whether they are a corporate or a not-for-profit or within the education sector. The first one is called a phishing attack, which is the most common type of attack leveraging social engineering techniques. And this is the one that most people would actually be familiar with. So what attackers do is they use emails, social media, any sort of messaging to trick victims into providing sensitive information or visiting compromised websites. The messages are composed in such a way as to attract a user's attention, and in many cases to actually stimulate curiosity by getting the user or the victim to provide a bit of information on a specific topic and then suggesting that they actually go to a specific link to gain further data. Phishing messages aim to gather users' information by often using a sense of urgency, like we've detected unusual sign-in activity, as you can see from the example on the screen. Phishing email messages often use a deceptive line to entice the recipient to believe that the email has actually come from a trusted source. So here are two real-life examples that we've put on the screen. One is from Windows, which purports to detect unusual sign-in activity of a user's Windows account and asks them to actually click on that link to enter their login credentials and basically make sure that nothing's gone wrong. And the second one is an example from Australia Post. So just in April, Australia Post was the victim of a scam, which actually sent emails to a lot of the people who had registered for their online notifications. And they asked users to actually pay, they said they had a failed delivery, and in order to redeliver, users had to pay $1.80 to have the package sent to them, otherwise it would go back to the sender. So the website looked absolutely legitimate. The only way to tell was to actually look closely at the URL, which was the website address. So whilst $1.80 might not seem like a lot of money, the actual aim was to steal credit card information from the user when they put that into the link. The next example is something called whaling, which is an evolution of a phishing attack. So it also uses sophisticated social engineering techniques to steal confidential information, personal data, and access credentials to restricted services or servers. What distinguishes this category from phishing that we just spoke about is the choice of targets. So it's often targeted at executives of private business or government agencies. Whaling adopts the same methods as spear phishing, but what it actually does is it masquerades as a critical business email sent from a legitimate authority, typically someone who's very senior within an organisation. So usually the content of the message is designed for upper management and reports some kind of fake company-wide concern, or includes some sort of highly confidential information. So what it does is it relies on intimidation because the email is from a senior member of the organisation, and urgency to trick a victim into actually making a rushed mistake. So for example, within the education sector, it could be that a principal's email has been hacked into, and they actually send an email to the accounts department saying that a particular school supplier needs to be paid urgently, and this is the amount that you need to transfer to this bank account. Because it's come from the principal, it's someone senior within an organisation, so usually it's relying on the victim to actually be quite intimidated and say, right, it's come from someone senior, I need to action this straight away, without conducting the proper checks. The third social engineering attack is something called a watering hole. And what that consists of is actually injecting malicious code into a public website that people regularly visit. So this is often linked to a state-sponsored attacker because a lot of research and time has to go into what kind of website to target and also the type of people that are visiting those websites. So one example which I pulled up was an attack on the Forbes website a couple of years ago. So what this is believed to be a state-sponsored attack by China, because the Forbes website is visited by a lot of employees within the financial industry and also the government agencies within the US. So by visiting this website, they were hoping to actually gain access to a lot of these types of organisations because these were the employees who were visiting the Forbes website most regularly. If you recall, the second most common category in sort of the education and not-for-profit sector in terms of the types of cyber incidents was around the category called error. And so what we're talking about when we say that is human error, so internal actors. So unfortunately, employees of an organisation, whether they be volunteers or people who are on contracts, they are the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Targeting them is actually an incredibly easy and effective way to gain unauthorised access to a organisation's networks. So what in 2018 the security firm Symantec found was that 55% of emails received by organisations were actually categorised as spam. 48% of malicious email attachments pretended to be office files, like, for example, a Word document or a PDF attachment. These statistics really reflect the success that criminals are having in targeting unsuspecting internal actors within an organisation. As a malicious external actor, why would you spend months trying to penetrate the security framework of an organisation when you can just send out 1,000 emails and hope that if even one person clicks on the link, that is success. So the key with internal actors to remember is that a lot of the time the result is an error by a well-meaning employee. So their intent most of the time is actually going to be non-malicious. It's just going to be an accident. So examples of human error can include things like an employee losing a laptop in a public space, a personal information is sent to an incorrect recipient in an email, or private information has not been disposed of securely. It can also include things like physical errors. So you might hold a door open for someone who is purporting to be an employee, but that means that you let them into an office. An employee or a volunteer might pick up an infected USB in a public area and put it into the work computer to see what's actually in it, in the hopes of returning it to the right person. Or, someone from an IT department might be at a computer and an actor looks at the credentials that are being typed in to access the computer network and the admin rights. So you can see that all of these scenarios are quite common and they can happen in any organisation, whether it's by a malicious employee or volunteer, but most often it's just someone who's trying to do the right thing. So what are some of the best defences that an organisation like a school or a religious or a church can actually employ to defend against social engineering attacks and human error? So one of the first ones is culture within an organisation. So an organisation's culture around online security and data management can have a material impact on the overall cyber risk of an organisation. A strong culture should focus on training employees and volunteers to actually build awareness of common forms of threats that may impact the particular sectors that you are operating in. It's also about empowering individuals to actually understand what their responsibilities are and the critical role that they play in the success of cybersecurity. Make it normal practice to report cyber risks to responsible people as soon as they present. And also it's about getting employees and volunteers to actually exercise caution if a peculiar email presents. Vigilance is also critical. So check a sender's email address before taking any action. If you get an email that says from a supplier that says something like, we've changed our bank account details, you need to send us funds to this account instead, employ a callback verification procedure. So call that supplier back to actually make sure that they actually sent the email and that is a legitimate request to change the bank details. And also verify all external visitors with a known employee. Another thing to do is focus on the target of the hackers, which is usually account credentials. So it's things like employing two-factor authentication to actually help manage unauthorized access or reduce unauthorized access to a system. Delete inactive user accounts, or if you've got a shared user account, for example, one that a lot of volunteers at the church may access, make sure that this is restricted to only public information and that they can't actually get into anything sensitive. And also monitor these accounts for any access anomalies. So if you see someone who's suddenly logging into their account at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday, then make sure this is logged so that you can actually ask and find out if that is legitimate access or if it's someone who's actually gotten their credentials. So overall, it's really about implementing uncomplicated and straightforward changes, which really are the best defences when it comes to social engineering attacks and preventing or minimising human error. So I thought I would just touch very briefly on the Australian mandatory notification legislation that came in last year. So this introduced mandatory reporting of any eligible data breach to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, or the OAIC for short. This applies to any entity governed by the Australian privacy principles, which is usually a company that has either more than $3 million in turnover, or they're an entity that provides a health service to a person, which would be the care organisations, They disclose personal information to another individual for some sort of benefit, service, or advantage. And it's worthwhile noting that not-for-profit organisations are not exempt from these rules. So when does an eligible data breach actually occur? It occurs when one of the two conditions on screen are met. But to summarise, it's really when there's unauthorised access or unauthorised disclosure of personal information, and a reasonable person would conclude that there's a likely risk of serious harm to an individual to whom the breached information relates. So examples of personal information can include things like health information, tax file numbers, credit information. It even applies to photos of a person or video recording of a person. The Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme in Australia has actually been in effect for more than 1 year now. And what the OAIC has done is released a report that looks at the data that they've collated in this time. So I've included this graph on the top reporting sectors around data breaches in the first year since the mandatory notification has been released. So it's interesting to see that both education and health service providers are one of the top 5 reporting sectors around data breaches that have occurred within these organisations. It also splits it up by human error, which is represented by the green, and malicious or criminal attack, which is the yellow, and then black is system fault. So, for example, when you look at the education sector, it shows that about 53% of the data breaches reported in the first year were the result of human error, followed by malicious or criminal attack. Within the health service provider sector, it actually shows that more of the data breaches were the result of human error than malicious or criminal attacks. So it just goes back to the previous slide on how it's really important for organisations, no matter what sort of sector you operate in, to really consider that internal threat around the employees and how to manage that. The full report is actually available on the OAIC website, and it's something that we really recommend reading because it's got a lot of valuable insight and data into it. So what can your organisation do to ensure that you are complying with the Australian privacy legislation? Firstly, it's about having a clear understanding of what type of personal or sensitive information is being held by your organisation. Ensure that all of your internal employees or volunteers are aware of what constitutes an eligible data breach and who within the organisation should be advised if they believe that a data breach has occurred. Also be aware of the potential penalties that may apply because they are significant. The Australian government is currently reviewing penalties and they're actually looking to introduce tougher penalties later this year. So the current regime applies a maximum fine of about 2.1 million for serious or repeated breaches, but what the regulator wants to do is actually increase these quite significantly to what is greatest of $10 million, 3 times the value of any benefit obtained through the misuse of information, or 10% of an entity's annual domestic turnover. So it's quite a significant increase to what the maximum penalty is now. What these reforms do is they underscore the significant responsibility that a regulator is placing on Australian entities to protect and secure the personal information of Australian citizens. So we just really wanted to touch very briefly on cyber insurance and transferring cyber risk to the insurance market. So as cyber risk exposures for organisations continue to increase and the threat landscape evolves, we are seeing an increasing purchase of standalone cyber insurance policies by entities because they recognise that they may not possess the expertise to actually deal with a cyber event in a crisis, or there's a financial benefit in taking out insurance at a certain premium rather than retaining the risk, or Traditional insurance policies like your property insurance or your liability are actually being specifically amended to exclude cyber risk exposures because it was never the intention for these policies to cover these types of risks in the first place. Cyber insurance is unique in the fact that it covers both first party, which when we say that means direct loss and out-of-pocket expenses incurred by an organisation, and also third party costs. So these are defence and liability costs that an organisation may incur for damages to others that are alleged to have been caused by the organisation. So really critical first party costs include incident response or breach response costs. So what this refers to is an organisation actually obtaining immediate access to specialist vendors in the event of an actual or suspected cyber event. It provides really important support to an organisation straight away to vendors like forensic IT specialists, public relation firms to help minimise any damage to the organisation's brand, and also legal firms to help you assess whether there's any liability that may be present. It also covers loss of profit or loss of revenue if you're no longer able to operate at normal levels, both during and after a cyber event. And it also pays for costs to restore, replace, or recreate corrupted data that may have been stolen or damaged in a hack. When we're talking about third-party liabilities, it's around the defence and liability costs that an organisation may incur for damage to others. The key one here is around privacy liability. So for example, if a data breach occurs, a third party may bring a claim against an organisation because you allegedly breached their right to privacy. In Australia, there's not many claims for third party liability to date, as almost all claims under cyber insurance policies have been around providing cover for first party costs. So specifically for ANIP members, Marsh has worked with both ANIP and leading cyber insurer CFC to create a cyber insurance solution for your consideration. Through this arrangement, members are able to access very comprehensive policy coverage. We really believe that the policy coverage is what sets our arrangement apart. Coverage is a fundamental part of cyber insurance because organisations will rely on it responding straight away in the event of an actual or suspected claim. Within this, we specifically negotiated competitive rates for organisations who have less than 50 mil of revenue. There's also an any one claim limit, which effectively creates unlimited reinstatements for each unconnected loss within the policy period. So for example, if you've got a $1 million limit and that is exhausted in the event of a claim, within the same policy period, that $1 million limit will actually reset. So it'll allow you to claim under the policy for any new incident that may occur. And that's something that's quite unique to this arrangement. We've also negotiated a Marsh and mandatory endorsement that provides over 25 coverage enhancements to the standard CFC policy wording, which really further bolsters the policy coverage that we have been able to negotiate for ANIP members. If your revenue is less than $10 million, there's actually no policy retention that's applicable to any claim. And all insureds who are on this arrangement actually have access to 60 minutes free privacy consultation by leading legal law firm Clyde & Co. So this service can be utilised even if there's no privacy breach and you just want some general advice. So it could look at things like what parts of the privacy legislation are applicable to our organisation, general privacy compliance issues. So it may be that you need some legal advice on how you actually comply with privacy requirements. General best practice. So what are other organisations within your sector actually doing when it comes to privacy? And then also helps with initial breach assessment. So if you have been breached or you have suffered a privacy breach, this can help you have that initial advice on what you should do. So it's really great kind of risk management piece that has been added on to this arrangement. So in order to get a quotation, please contact Neil and he will be able to discuss the next steps. It's very straightforward. It's a very short proposal form, and we could certainly get you those quotations straight away for you to consider putting in place a standalone cyber insurance policy. So in this last part of the webinar, really just wanted to go through some cyber incidents and claims, because I think this is where the value of cyber insurance really does kind of shine. So this is just some recent cyber incidents that have hit the headlines, specifically around the education and not-for-profit sectors, but there have been a lot of incidents that have impacted care or health organisations as well. One very recent incident that occurred in the education sector actually happened last week, and it was the Australian National University that had a data breach. It exposed personal details of staff, students and visitors going back 19 years. Now, the breach itself was only detected 3 weeks ago, but it's believed to actually have first occurred in 2018. So if the hackers have been sitting in the system since 2018, you can imagine just how much personal and sensitive information they've actually had access to. In late 2018, human error was believed to be behind the publication of more than 300 students' records at a Melbourne high school. So it was actually published onto the intranet site by an employee who accidentally did so. And it included things like medical and mental health conditions of students, medications, and also learning and behavioural difficulties. So the first example we wanted to go through is actually one that's occurred in December 2018 within the education sector. So it relates to a private school that is actually a boarding school for pupils aged 13 to 18. So in December last year, the school was actually hacked and fraudsters gained access to the school's email systems. So what they did was they set up a fake email account purporting to be from the school's fees supervisor that looked very similar to the school's actual legitimate address, but there was just one additional letter added to the end. So it was very hard to detect by parents who believed that it was actually a legitimate email from the school. What they did is, instead of applying a scattergun approach, they were quite clever in that they specifically targeted parents who were based overseas because they probably believed they'd be more likely to fall for the scam. They also provided in the email financial incentive for the parents by offering an early bird discount of 20% if they were to pay the school fees by a certain date. In total, 3 parents fell for the scam, transferring over $60,000 to the fraudster's account. Thankfully, 2 of the parents were able to recover funds from their banks once they were made aware of the scam by the school. But it still left one parent out of pocket over $20,000, and the school felt that they were morally obliged to refund the parent for the loss. They actually had a policy with CFC, and they purchased the cybercrime section as well, which included something called push payment fraud. So what that means is, under a cyber insurance policy, any sort of claims settlement or claims money that's paid out is usually direct to the insured. But this section under the policy actually pays out directly to an affected third party, in this case the parent. So CFC's insurance policy was able to reimburse the parent $20,000 that they were left out of pocket directly. So it helps to protect the reputation of the school and also the financial state of the parent. And it's worth pointing out that CFC is actually the only insurer in the insurance market who's able to provide this type of coverage. So whilst there may be cheaper insurance cover alternatives available, this is one of the key claims areas that we're seeing impacting the education sector, because there's a lot of emails obviously that go out to parents around the payment of school fees. So the key message with this claim is that it really illustrates a growing trend for these types of attacks to occur. CFC actually said that they saw a flurry of these types of incidents just before Christmas, with parents being contacted about changes to school account details or receiving offers of discounts if they paid school fees early. What it represents is a shift in the nature of cyber risk in the education sector. So in the past, educational establishments were primarily focused on the risk of a data breach, given the amount of confidential information that you hold. However, cybercrime is also on the rise, particularly this type of claim around fraudulent school fees. So it's no longer sort of safe to rely just on to focus solely on data breaches when you're purchasing a cyber policy. It's important to think about the coverage that you're actually getting, and that this is actually comprehensive enough to evolve with the changing cyber risk landscape. The second claim example actually happened to a not-for-profit organisation. So they're a charity that aims to make affordable home ownership possible for low-income families. However, even if this is specific to the not-for-profit sector, it's really a claim that can impact any organisation. It can impact education sector, it can impact a care organisation. It's really, when I go into the details, it's really something that is quite easy to happen. So in this particular example, the CEO was having difficulties processing payment for an item that he was purchasing online on behalf of the charity. So the CEO called up the seller to try to resolve the payment issue. And during that conversation, the seller convinced the CEO to actually allow him to access his computer remotely via a program called TeamViewer. So the CEO, of course, trusting this seller, installed the program, which then gave this seller access. However, as soon as the seller gained access to the CEO's computer, he immediately began running around, looking at what information this charity actually held, and actually found over 1,000 folders containing personal information on low-income families that the charity had helped to find housing for. After reporting the claim to the insurer, the forensic investigation team conducted a thorough investigation, and they established that the hacker actually managed to access details of about 420 individuals, all of whom the charity notified, and they were provided with credit monitoring services. The total cost to carry out the investigations, for the legal advice, the notification costs to the infected individuals came up to to about $63,000, all of which was picked up by the cyber policy with CFC. So it shows that the CEO placed his good faith in this seller, who took advantage of the trust, and the result was a very costly data breach for this organisation. So just in sort of closing, I think there's no doubt that technology continues to play an extremely profound role in shaping the risk landscape for organisations in all sorts of sectors. So whilst technological advancement should absolutely be embraced, companies or organisations should really take a proactive approach in managing the cyber risk that it brings. Enterprise-level governance should be in place to create accountability. Make sure that the organisation has a culture where employees and volunteers and even students are really taking ownership of cyber security and have an understanding of where the exposures actually lie. The focus should be on resiliency. So not just looking at how to prevent a cyber attack, but also how to respond to one if it does impact your organisation. Manage it like any other risk with a comprehensive approach that employs planning, mitigation, risk transfer through insurance, if that's something that your organisation wants to consider, and also potentially testing response scenarios. So a common example is when organisations actually send fake phishing emails to their employees. And if anyone clicks on it, then they are then sort of trained further on how to recognise an email that may not be coming from a legitimate source. So that's the end of our formal presentation. We'll now pass on to questions if anyone on the webinar has anything you'd like to ask.
Are we on question?
We've just unmuted the webinar attendees, so please feel free to just raise any questions that you have.
We understand everyone's now unmuted, so please, any questions, let us know.
Yes, it's Kim Harris here from the Anglican Diocese of North West Australia. I sent a note through just to ask if we could have a list of all the relevant legislation which has been covered during the seminar today, but just getting a collection of those circulated would be very handy. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sure, no problem. And we can also provide a link to that 12-month insight report by the regulator, because it's really great information and something that any sort of Australian organisation would find valuable. So we can certainly circulate that.
And we'll highlight what's relevant to your sectors as well within that legislation.
Thank you.
Can I say something, Naomi, from Bendigo here?
Sure.
Yep. When the legislation came in last year, we actually created a policy and a data breach response plan that I put on our website. Anybody who wants to go into the website can access that. We're quite happy to share. So, Kim,
yeah, that's absolutely a fantastic risk management tool to actually have written policies like that, so that's easily accessible by anyone who may, have a user account with your organisation, but also so it's easily updated and the most kind of relevant information is available. So really, really great idea.
Any other questions?
Just wondering also, we do regular training with our staff in here about cyber risk. I'm wondering whether this presentation will be available at a later date for me to use it during a staff meeting.
Yeah, we'll send that through to Neil, and then he can circulate that to all of the members. So absolutely.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, well, if anyone has any other questions that you think about after this webinar, please feel free to send them through to Neil and he can circulate them to us. Kelly and I are more than happy to answer any questions that may come up either, after this webinar, or maybe from your employees or volunteers. If there's anything that comes out of training sessions or staff meetings, we're absolutely here to help, because the webinar was really around sort of cyber risk and helping organisations to actually understand what the sources of them were, and also just some ideas on how to mitigate that and manage that. So hopefully you found this useful. And yeah, if you've got anything else that you'd like to ask, please feel free to do so post this webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.